an Atari 2600 into a retro iPod dock. So I read recently that Steve Jobs actually, very briefly in his career, worked for Atari, so an Atari 2600 iPod dock. So I'm going to be basing the iPod dock off one of these amplifiers. You can get these off eBay and Amazon, they're pretty common. You can pay upwards to £20 if you want one with an LCD readout screen. This one costs £10 plus free shipping. And it also has a little built-in FM radio on this module here. And this red wire is the antenna, so I'll be getting rid of that. But one of the first things I want to do is remove these pots here for the volume and the treble and the bass, because I want to extend these with wires so we can use it on the Atari case. And I probably have a look at some of the others as well. I will more than likely unsolder these little tactile switches here that control the fast forward and the menu, etc. So I'll be extending those out as well. So I removed the little potentiometers off the amplifier, and I've actually cut the legs off them. They've got like a rivet going through here, so I actually use that as a solder point, put the wire through, and use the back of that as a solder pad. So they're in there quite tight. And I've used some flexible wire, not solid core wire, because we'll be moving this around a bit, getting it in position, and I've made sure I left it quite long. So my intention is to use as many of these switch holes and switches as I can to actual power the amplifier, make changes to the volume and tone, etc. as I can, rather than just filling them with a dummy switch. Now, looking at this potentiometer here, the foam backing that goes on the original 2600 switches fits over it quite nicely, and what I've actually got one of the aluminium pegs off one of the 2600 switches, and I'm thinking that if I can grind this leg down here so it will take this actual aluminium peg, then having it coming up and through, although it's now going to be a turning action instead of a actual switching action, it'll keep some of that authenticity. So what I've done, I drilled a small hole down into this shaft here, which is just plastic, and I've self-tapped a small screw, and what I'm going to do is epoxy this original aluminium shaft here onto the top of there. That screw should give me enough support inside so it doesn't snap off, and hopefully that should work out fine. So the epoxy is dried now, and I'm quite happy how that's turned out. I've put the little foam sponge on there just while there was a little bit of wet epoxy around there, so that's held in place, and I shall be able to mount it now into the Atari, and somehow probably hot glue or make some kind of bracket to hold this to the inner case. So you've just got this piece sticking up through here, so it looks like an original switch, but just now you actually turn it instead of up and down. Also, the switches on the little amplifier have got a forward and back button for choosing songs, and I want to keep them as well, and to make this authentic as well, to use the actual switches in the Atari 2600, I've got these select switches that just move up and down like so, and I can just directly solder onto the little tactile switches on the amplifier board here. These ones, I can just override them with a wire, and I figured out that it's these two pins here that make contact. I just used a continuity tester just to test, and it's these two here, and also these two on the other side make contact as well, but you're only going to need two legs. So the actual on-off switch I'm going to use is the on-off switch that's on the Atari 2600, but what I've done, I've modded this one by drilling out the centre core of this aluminium tube and putting an LED down at the bottom there, and running the LED wires out through the ridges inside the switch, and there's room in there to do this. And in one of my very early videos I showed you how to mod an Atari 2600 with a power LED, so if you want to do that you can check that out as well. But I just thought it'd be nice to have it actually inside the on-off switch rather than having to drill another hole in the Atari 2600 case to have a power LED. So what I'm going to do is just disable this LED on here and solder directly onto the legs, and then we've got a power switch with an LED inside. So that's all of the switches on the Atari 2600. All the original switches are going to actually be doing something. They're not just there blanking out an empty space, so I'm quite pleased with that. So now I'm starting to put things together, and the two speakers, I've actually fastened those down with some hot glue, and they're in there really solidly. Here in this corner there was a mounting pillar similar to this one, and I had to cut it away to make room for this speaker, because I wanted the speakers just here, because hopefully I'll be able to use the heat vent grills that are already in the Atari 2600, and that'll be sufficient to let the sound out, so I won't have to do any drilling or spoiling anything cosmetically to the case itself. So now what I'm going to be concentrating on is wiring some of this up, some of the switches wired up here, and also the speakers. I'm just going to use the original connectors that are on here. I'm not going to bother soldering any new connectors on there, I'll just leave them in situ, and then also add a jack plug to the back so I can put the 12 volt power in here through the back, and just connect it up to the jack plug that's already on the amplifier here. So I'll show you the progress so far, and what I've done, I've now got all the switches in place. These ones turn for the volume, treble and bass. These two here, they select backwards and forwards on the track, and I've got an on-off switch here, and I've also placed an LED inside the switch itself, and I'll show you how to do this on an Atari 2600 on one of the very first videos I did, so I'll put a link down in the description where you can see how I did that. If we flip it over and have a look on the inside, I've made these brackets for the potentiometer switches here. I've got them slightly set back, so we've just got the actual aluminium of the original switches showing through here, so those brackets hold them quite firmly in there. And the selector switches and the on-off switch, I've just hot glued these down here in place, and they should be quite solid in there. If hot glue doesn't work, then I'll probably use araldite, but they seem quite solid. So now I'm looking at how to mount the iPod in the cartridge slot here on the 2600, and what I've got an old cartridge that didn't work, and I've cut the top off it. I'm going to use that as a kind of shroud bezel and have that built up there. And inside I've got some of these little plastic holders that I got with an iPod dock many years ago, and I've just saved these, and I've trimmed this one down so it will actually fit inside the shroud from the old cartridge, and I'm going to mount it all in there at a slight angle set back, so the actual screen on the iPod faces you while it's actually in there. So here's the actual iPod seat that it's going to dock to and sit on, and I had to cut down the plastic holder that I got from another iPod dock and fit it inside here, which is the top part of an old cartridge, like I said. So what I'm going to do now is these gaps and the base here I'm going to fill using some epoxy putty. So I'm going to build all this bottom up flat against here and fill in these two sides, and then what I'll do, I'll give it a coat of matte black paint. And also this connector here, it's got a USB on the end, that's epoxied in there, so that's going to stay there, and this USB will just connect directly to the USB on the amplifier, so there's no cutting and soldering to do there. So that's the iPod dock in place now, where the game cartridge slot used to be. So I think the next job is to start connecting some of these wires up. So here's where the potentiometers were originally connected, and I've soldered in the extension wires here so we can have them on the front of the 2600, and again using the original switches there. So all the switches on the front of the 2600 actually do something, which I'm really pleased with. None of them are blanks. So I actually cut the front pins on these potentiometers and desoldered the back. It made it a lot easier. Again, these tactile switches, like I said, I left them in place. We're just overriding them, soldered on to the bottom, tacked on. And here we've got the actual radio module with the USB connection, and I've actually just used hot glue and mounted it on a bit of a slant so we can get this cable in here no problem. And one last thing, which is here, I've actually put an antenna in there. I've made a little bracket and just hot glued that black bracket in place and hot glued the antenna to the side of that. Also, the hot glue has a little bit of insulation, so the actual metal bracket isn't interfering with the antenna in any way. So we've got a telescopic antenna now for the radio. So again, what I've done is just cut the bottom off this case, and I'm using that as a heatsink for the base of this, so those screws came in handy there. So I've got these little tweeter speakers that I've picked up, and I thought it'd be good if we made some detachable speakers to go on the iPod dock as well. And what I've got here is a paddle controller, and I dremeled out the top of the knob part of this, and it just happens to fit the actual tweeter inside quite nicely. I've taken all the components from inside the paddle controller out the way. I've just left this red button here just so we haven't got a hole there, and it fits in quite nice. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to glue that on top there, and you've got the lead coming out the back here that we can connect to the iPod dock. So a quick demonstration then. We turn it on here, and
try to rescue her friend.
If there's no iPod in there, it will go straight to radio, and we can select stations with these switches here, up and down, go back. And then if we put an iPod in, automatically detect the iPod. We can fine tune the volume, the tone, and the bass here. And of course, you can go and select the iPod from these switches. Catch you next time, guys. And I also forgot to mention, it's got a little remote control.